Now let's finish styling our menu item component. So what we need to add to make this component look like this component is a white background for our content, a hover effect that increases the size of the background image, as well as a transition in the opacity of that content box whenever we hover over it. So how do we do that? Well, first let's go to our menu item component and let's go to our styles. In our content, we are going to add a background color of white and an opacity of 0.7. And now, when we look at our app, we see that we have that background. As for the font, let's go to Google Fonts, and let's look for Open Sans Condensed. We're going to add that to our selection, and then we'll copy this link that Google provides us. Then let's go into our index.html and add it right here underneath our other links that were provided for us. Now inside of our app.css, let's add a rule where our font family in our body, so everything inside of our body tags, we want to use Open Sans Condensed. Okay, now if we look, our application, our content box is styled the way that it was before. So how do we capitalize the title? Well, because we're writing JavaScript, we can actually use any JavaScript method that exists on strings. So because we know our title is a string, we can call to uppercase, and this will uppercase our text. And as far as our hover transition goes, this is going to be a bit of CSS that I will explain, but I don't want to go too in-depth about it, but I'll definitely cover enough that everything should make sense. So what we're going to do is we are actually going to add a new component first to our menu item component. So our background image, we want it whenever we hover over our menu item to increase, right? So we're going to add this class name of background image onto this div, and this div is going to get that style instead of our containing div. Now, the reason for this is because we actually don't want this image when it scales to be bigger, right? We just want to see the effect get bigger within our div when we hover over it. So the issue here is that some of you might think, why don't we just wrap this div around our content? Well, the problem is if we increase the size of this div, we don't want this to also increase. We want the size of our content stay exactly the same. So if we do this and we go into our styles, we're going to add that background image selector, and we're going to give it a width of 100%, a height of 100%, so that that image is always the size of our container, right? No matter what our menu item container size becomes, whether it's large or whether it's regular, we want it to always have and share the same dimensions. So then we want to move those background properties off of our div and onto our background image. And now if we look, we'll see that it looks like our content is actually inside as a sibling. But we don't want this. We want our content to always be in the center of our actual menu item. So what we're going to do is we're going to add a we're going to add a position absolute. And position absolute is saying that no matter what happens, no matter what other elements are on the page, the position of this content will always be whatever the position calculation will be. So it's kind of like if we were to add like a right value of 100 pixels, which would mean that it's coming in from the right side by 100 pixels. We're saying that those are the only things that go into the calculation of the position of our content, right? Nothing else. So now if we look, we'll see that our content is always in the center. And now our background image has no children because this removes this from the flow of the elements of our menu item. So now the background image is the only item that's getting calculated in its flow, so it doesn't consider this anymore, and now it's taking up the whole size of our menu item. Now, we need that hover effect, and that hover effect is actually going to go on the menu item. So I actually have that code written for you right here. And let's paste it in and take a look at what it does. So we're saying that using this hover selector, right, for menu item, when you hover over it, I want the cursor to go to a pointer. Instead of an arrow, we want the finger. And then inside of that, we're saying that any element with the class background image, we want to give it a transform property of scaling it by 1. So whenever we hover, we want to scale any background image inside of it by 1.1. So essentially 1.1 times the size of the current image, right? And then our transition property is saying that we want to target the transform. So whenever it scales, we want it to take 6 seconds. And then we want to use a cubic Bezier value of this. So cubic Bezier is a pretty complicated math calculation, which determines the speed in which this transformation occurs. Now, it's going to be a lot to kind of explain this, and it's quite a big detour, but I'm going to give you a link that will show you how you can understand what cubic Bezier does, but it just enables us to have a smoother transition as far as our transform goes. And then we're also saying we want to change our content opacity to 0.9 whenever we hover over it. Now, if we look, we see that our image is growing, right? But it seems to be growing outside of the size of our menu item. So this is an overflow, and we don't want that, right? But we're getting that effect. So what we're going to do on our menu item is we're going to do overflow hidden. And now if we look, we'll see that we have our transition effect. And just like that, our menu item now looks like our final product. Now, before we continue, let's just commit all our changes. Let's go back to our terminal and let's just add everything that we've done. So we have broken our home page into smaller components, and then we also finished styling our menu item component. Okay. And now let's push to master. Awesome. Okay. Now that we've finished styling our menu item and our home page, we're going to tackle routing and how we're going to render different pages in the next lesson.